It's my pleasure to welcome you to our afternoon keynote speakers, and also my great pleasure to welcome back Dr. Carl Trueman to our Veritas conference. He's taught on the faculties of the universities of Nottingham and Aberdeen, and then in 2001 he moved to this side of the pond, and since 2018 he's served as a professor at Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania. Dr. Trueman is a contributing editor at First Things and Touchstone magazine. His most recent books are The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Expressive Individualism, Cultural Amnesia, and The Road to Sexual Revolution. I think a very important book, and also one that I haven't yet had a chance to look at, but look forward to, Strange New World, How Thinkers and Activists Redefined Identity and Sparked the Sexual Revolution. Dr. Trueman is joined here by his wife, Katrina. We welcome them both to Providence. And now please join me in welcoming Dr. Trueman to the podium.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you all again. I spoke here last year. I remember many years ago, and I'm an ordained Presbyterian minister, and I would fill pulpits at churches around about Philadelphia, and my oldest son once commented to me, he said, "Dad, you notice nobody ever invites you back to preach." Which struck me. I hadn't thought of it that way before, but it's always a kind of relief to get invited back somewhere when you've spoken. So it really is a pleasure to be here today. You've made me feel really good about myself. I want to speak on the grace of friendship. Take a little bit of a different tack from some of the other speakers. By the way, thanks so much to the other speakers. I'm sorry I have to leave straight after my talk today to get back to Pittsburgh, and I wasn't here for my friend Fran's talk yesterday, but I enjoyed Ken's work this morning, and I'd never been to a Tolkien and transgender seminar before, so it was a very interesting afternoon. I've given quite a lot of lectures recently where I've started with noting the same anniversary. And the anniversary I want to note at the beginning of this talk is that it is 80 years ago that C.S. Lewis delivered the lectures that became his little book, The Abolition of Man. And I would put C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, in that category of books that I talk to students about sometimes at Grove, where I say, this book was more prophetic and spoke more truth than the author could possibly have known at the time he wrote it. On the negative side, I would put Wilhelm Reich's Sexual Revolution in that category. I think Alistair McIntyre's book, After Virtue, fits into that category. Philip Reef's Triumph of the Therapeutic, 1966. Read it today, feel it could have been written yesterday, fits into that category. C.S. Lewis' Abolition of Man fits very much into that category. What Lewis identifies in 1943 is what one might call an anthropological crisis. And I think what we are living through at this particular point in time is an anthropological crisis. There are a lot of symptoms of that. Maybe symptoms that are not merely symptoms, but are also helping to drive it forward. The confusion over the question, what is a woman? The phenomenon of transhumanism, the fragmented nature of identity politics. All of them, I think, track back to a fundamental crisis or a fundamental failure to be able to define what it means to be human. To that we might add artificial intelligence. I'm somewhat of a skeptic about artificial intelligence, whether it will ever replace what it means to be a human. It may do so, of course, if we so eviscerate what it means to be human out of all those things that are most important to being human, then yes, maybe we'll be able to replace ourselves with algorithms and computers. And it's those things that are most important to being human that I want to sort of touch on this afternoon. Kindness, forgiveness, gratitude, and I think I would put into that category friendship. Friendship is something that I think cannot be reduced to the level of a computer algorithm. I'm struck, as a historian, one of the things that historians most like to do is try to explain everything that happened in the past. But every now and then you come up against things, you come up against actions, you come up against phenomena that really defy explanation. It doesn't surprise me that my most recent book wasn't mentioned in the introduction, because my most recent book is the book that nobody's talking about, nobody's reading. It's the Oxford Handbook to Calvin and Calvinism that I edited with my friend Bruce Gordon at Yale Divinity School. Bruce is my oldest academic friend. I won't give you the full story, but we met in a monastery in 1988, would you believe, and have been friends ever since. But that indicates that my background is that of a Reformation historian. And my studies in Reformation threw up a couple of mysteries. One of the great mysteries is the relationship between Martin Luther and his brilliant, I hesitate to call him sidekick because that reduces his stature, but his brilliant second in command at Wittenberg, Philip Melanchthon. One of the interesting things about Philip Melanchthon is he's essentially an Erasmian. I actually did my Ph.D. on how Erasmians appropriated the Reformation. That was part of my Ph.D. And Philip Melanchthon is an Erasmian. He holds very much, I think, to Erasmus's view of the bondage of the will, which anybody who knows anything about Luther will know that that is the thing that gives Luther apoplexy in 1524, 1525. He, in later life, moves in the direction of accommodating his understanding of the Lord's Supper in a more Calvinistic direction, for want of a better term. He begins to draw closer, it seems to me, to John Calvin. These are things that Luther anathematizes others for. Yet when Erasmus dies in 1536 and Luther hears of his death, his comment is, what a shame he didn't die in 1516, after he'd given us the Greek New Testament and before he'd done all the damage. When Zwingli, who of course was a big opponent of Luther on the Lord's Supper, dies in 1531 on the battlefield at Cappel, and news arrives in Wittenberg, Luther's only response is to say, well, those who live by the sword may expect to die by the sword. And yet Melanchthon is exempted from this. Melanchthon is a dear colleague of Luther, and Luther never criticizes him. He'll pull Melanchthon's leg because Melanchthon was into astrology, but he will never go after Melanchthon. And I came to the conclusion that that's because they were friends. Friendship is something that defies logical analysis, if I could put it that way. There's something about friendship, perhaps a little bit like hatred as well on the other side, that makes human beings unpredictable. And dare I say it, makes human beings human. There is a richness to friendship, which is an important part of what it means to be a human being. And I think friendship is under huge pressure at this current moment in time. One could outline a number of reasons why friendship is under pressure. One of them, I think, is technology. I want to make the case in this lecture that embodiment is actually an important part of friendship. I was very gratified. In fact, as I sat and listened to the various presentations today, I felt my paper fading away as one after the other of my points was sort of touched on by somebody else. But in the very first session today, the two Dominican friars talking about friendship and talking about their podcast, making the point about, I was very gratified by the one point that was made, that friendship can sort of begin virtually. But really, to be true friendship, it has to finally find its sort of place in the real, embodied world. And I would say there is a difference between Zooming with a friend that you know as a real body and friending somebody on Facebook whom you have never met. Technology, I think, certainly the way it rules us, is attenuating friendship. And I'm going to return to that point later. I also think there is a deep seated belief or intuition in modern men and women that we are free and unencumbered people, that really we are sovereign and autonomous. And I think that what that does, it does many things, but one of the things it tilts us towards is thinking of all relationships as contractual, and all relationships as ultimately important because they serve me and my desires and my happiness. Technology and that way of thinking about what it means to be human, I think, militate against rich understandings of friendship. And friendship is a very rich phenomenon. It may sound trivial, but one of my favorite movies growing up as a kid, and then when my own boys were young, it became, thanks to me, one of their favorite movies. They noticed that birthday and Christmas, I would always buy them one of my favorite westerns, which we can then watch together. Gunfight at the OK Corral. Kirk Douglas and Burt Lancaster. And there's a great scene towards the end of that, just before the gunfight. By the way, I'm a Reformation scholar. I've only ever been to Geneva once. I've been to Tombstone twice. I'm a huge gunfight at the OK Corral man. I've stood on the sacred, I won't say turf because it's Tombstone. I've stood on the sacred dust several times. There's a scene towards the end of that where Kirk Douglas plays Doc Holliday, pulls himself out of bed, and he turns to his girlfriend and he says, he's going out to fight, and his girlfriend says, you know you're going to get killed, and he says, if I'm going to die, at least let me die with the only friend I've ever had. And that's a powerful scene. And it's powerful because I think friendship resonates with us. We understand friendship is powerful and important. The betrayal of friends bites hard. Just before I came up to speak, I was chatting to someone who was telling me about the breakdown of friendships in the past that clearly still haunt in some way. So I want to talk today about why that might be. There is, of course, a risk. I think friendship is a bit like humor. If you analyze a joke, you really destroy it as a joke. The whole point of a joke in some ways is that it's just funny. Analyzing it really doesn't help you understand the experience of the joke. But I want to offer some thoughts today on friendship at the risk of turning it into a rather dry topic. I want to ask the question, first of all, what is friendship? And I want to go to the Bible. Not only has the passage from John that I was going to be talking about, the Upper Room Discourse, been mentioned once, I think it's probably been mentioned about 16 times. So I will not zero in on that so much. What I want to do is go to an earlier passage, a passage in the Old Testament, that I think gives us great insights into what friendship is. It comes from Exodus 33. And the context is, Exodus at this point, it's a passage dealing with the tabernacle. And we're hearing about the meetings that would take place within the tabernacle, within the tent of meeting between God and Moses. Exodus 33, verse 9. I'll read verses 9 to 11. When Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. And when all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all the people would rise up and worship, each at his tent door. And then comes the great verse, verse 11. Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. And I happen to think that the passage in the Upper Room Discourse, when Jesus says, no longer do I call you servants, I call you friends, is picking up on that passage. That it is a deeply covenantal moment that is happening here in Exodus and is happening in the Gospel of John. Think about what is going on here. The context of this meeting is God's gracious covenant condescension and election. God knows Moses. He knows Israel. The relationship that he has struck with Israel and with her representative Moses is not one, we might say, that brings any benefit from God, for God. It is the overflowing of God's grace towards a people that we're told were not particularly strong or attractive. Why did God choose Israel? He chose Israel because he chose Israel. Because it was a way of demonstrating that actually he wasn't swayed by intrinsic qualities. He simply graciously committed himself to these people. It speaks of a dependency. The people of Israel at this point are dependent upon the Lord their God. And it speaks of an obligation not rooted in a natural relation. We might say it's not the covenant of creation that is being enacted here. It is God's covenant with Israel that is the overflow of the superabundance of his grace. And notice how we might draw lessons from this for thinking about human friendship. First of all, I think it's an intimate relationship. It's taking place in a tent. The other children of Israel are not able to see what is going on there. It is a private conversation, we might say, that is taking place between God and Moses at this point. It involves a giving of God himself to his people in grace, not for any ulterior benefit. God gains nothing from this relationship. He delights to give himself in this relationship to his people. Israel, we might say, is not a means to some selfish end for the Lord. God's giving of himself to his people here is an end in itself. There's a particularity to this relationship as well. And, of course, the language of face, I think, is critical. It's language of the Aaronic blessing, of course. It will be picked up in the great blessing of number 6, that Aaron is commanded to speak over the people. The language of face is critical. I'm very influenced by the writings of the English philosopher Roger Scruton on the face, where he makes the point repeatedly in his writings that faces are not just like any other part of the body. I might say to my students, I hold my wife's hand when we go out for a walk. But if I were to say to them, I kissed my wife's face before I left for work this morning, that would sound weird. It would be technically correct, but that is not typically how we speak about kissing. When we kiss somebody's face, we kiss them. When we see somebody smiling, we don't say, person X's face smiled at me. We say, person X smiled at me. I think the language of face here is critical. When God speaks with Moses face to face, there is a direct personal intimacy there that is being indicated by the passage. We might say, if we bring this over into the realm of human beings, it goes to the point that the Father made this morning, that real friendship, ultimately, to be truly fulfilled, has to take place in physical proximity at some level. To communicate with somebody via text, to communicate with somebody by email, may be convenient, but it's barely interpersonal communication. The face is critically important. So with that in mind, I will skip over the section I'd written on the upper room discourse, as I feel that's been sort of done to death today by my predecessors. It's always the risk when you come in as the penultimate speaker that you have nothing new to say in your lecture. I want to ask, what does human friendship do? And I want to ask this question because I want to conclude. I always conclude my lectures in a very depressing way. I remember we were laughing last night at dinner. Fran Mayer was reminding me of Rusty Reno's comment a few years ago that he could always tell when Fran and I were having lunch in Philadelphia because the big black cloud was visible from Manhattan over where we were meeting. I want to end by arguing that the loss of friendship in our modern culture has led to, or certainly feeds into, some of the terrible social ills that I think we are witnessing. Anxiety, for example. I will come to that in a little bit. What does friendship do? Well, I think it involves the gracious, non-contractual giving of one to another that gives that other value. Friendship, if you like, at its most basic level, addresses loneliness. Very struck in the Genesis accounts, of course, that the one thing that is not good in creation before the narrative of the fall is that man is alone. Man is not built to be alone. He names all of the animals, but he cannot find any animal there that can relate to him in a way that meets his loneliness. One could speculate as to why that is, but one might say all of the other animals are instinctive creatures. There is nobody that he can freely, reciprocally relate to as a free human being. Friendship addresses loneliness. Friendship provides the recognition by another that comes freely and makes us feel, it sounds bad to put it this way, but I don't mean it bad, makes us feel good about ourselves. Makes us feel that we are people of worth. And I think in some ways, therefore, friendship is sort of more important than family, in an odd way. Not that family isn't important, but you know that phrase, I was thinking, is there any way I could illustrate this? You know that phrase, a face that only a mother could love? And the point there is, it doesn't matter what a disaster you are, it doesn't matter what you look like, your mother still loves you. Well, that's great. Except your mother is somewhat obliged to love you. How much more wonderful is it when somebody who is not naturally obliged to love you, to love your face, loves you? The recognition that comes freely from another who is under no obligation, I think, is a richer form of recognition. A more powerful form of recognition. It's one thing to be recognized by a family member who's kind of obliged. It's one thing to be recognized by an employer. It is so much more delightful and profound to be recognized by one who has no natural obligation to do so. It takes us, if you like, to the profundity of what it means to be a social human being. Secondly, I think friendship embodies dependency and obligation. The great myth of the modern human person is that we are free and autonomous. And much in our culture is pressing towards that conclusion at this time. Much of it, I think, focuses upon what we might call bodily functions. At the heart of the sexual revolution is the idea that sex should be an individual, free and autonomous, costless exercise. I've used this example numerous times, but my wife and I were about 18 months ago, maybe just 12 months ago, I can't remember. We were walking through a town in Pennsylvania, Carlisle, one Friday evening, having been to dinner, and we found ourselves in the middle of a pro-abortion rally. It was a pretty desultory affair. I think there were about 12 of them or something. They didn't look particularly scary or intimidating. My wife, of course, she's very sensitive. She gets very upset about these people. I'm English. I'm completely insensitive. I am always just looking for, is there something here I can use as an illustration in class? And the protest provided that. One of the protesters was waving a banner around that said, consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy. I've typically used that in lectures when I talk about technology and the power of technology, because it's only in a technological world that that sign has any plausibility whatsoever. But it also speaks to the way we think about the sexual nature of our bodies today. That we think sex is an individual personal recreation with no social consequences beyond the pleasure or pain it brings to us as individuals. There is an awful lot that presses against the idea of us being dependent today. We're not just physically dependent, though. I would say we're also psychologically dependent. And one of the things about friendship is it witnesses to that. We could have debates about the sex nature of the human body and the consequences of our physical actions. But I think when we think about why is friendship important, why these non-contractual relationships that sometimes people are willing to sacrifice everything for, in a way that makes no logical sense whatsoever, why are they important? Because I think we are built to be psychologically dependent beings as well. My sense of self-worth, my sense of the joys or the sorrows of my existence is connected to my relationship to other people. And friendship, I think, is a powerful witness to that. And I think, as Ken talked about earlier on, friendship also, therefore, provides a basic building block for those wider structures of dependency, the communities in which we find ourselves. I think the loss of friendship in the modern world is devastating for communities, because communities are built upon that overflow of grace towards others, built upon kindness, built upon an intuitive dependence upon and respect for other people. I would also say that friendship allows us to avoid abstraction. What do I mean by that? I think life cannot be understood in abstract terms, and yet so much of the way we think about life today is done in abstractions. Much philosophy and much of our politics rests upon discussion of abstractions and abstract causes. I think real human relations defy that. Again, an example I've used in other lectures, but yesterday morning I was giving my semesterly lecture on Peter Singer. And I'm talk about Peter Singer, and of course I conclude the lecture by flagging up the interview he gave where he's asked if his care for his mother struggling from Alzheimer's was inconsistent with his view that people with Alzheimer's are no longer persons, therefore have no rights and can be euthanized. And Singer, and I'm quoting almost exactly here, Singer makes the comment, yes, I guess it is somewhat inconsistent, but it is, I guess I found that it's a bit different when it's your own mother. The point being, she's not an abstraction. She's not an abstraction. To which my response would be, then why build your ethics on abstractions? Do not particulars and particular relationships have to play a significant role here? And I go on to engage, I get the students to engage in a thought experiment where we have Robert George and Peter Singer walking down Nassau Street in Princeton late one night, and they hear a baby crying in a doorway. And I ask the students, do you think they respond in a different way to that baby? Is it that Robert George says, it's a baby, we need to get the baby to hospital and we need to find out where the mother is and get her help? And Peter Singer responds, well, the pub's close in 10 minutes. If we do that, we won't get one last drink in before we go to bed. Let's leave the baby here for the wild animals to eat because he isn't a person anyway. That's not what happens. No student has ever thought that that is what's going to happen because they know that baby is not an abstraction. Well, what does friendship do? Friendship teaches us that community is not an abstraction. It's made up out of interpersonal relationships between real human persons. Think about the problem in Marxist theory, or one of the many problems in Marxist theory during the 20th century. Surely the big one was this: Marxism was never able to find that transnational proletarian consciousness that transcended local ties. In fact, if you look at the history of communism in the 20th century, I think a good case can be made for saying communism only ever really gains power where it's able to ride on the back of local commitments, ethnic commitments, community commitments. What I think friendship does, friendship reveals that to be human is not to be an abstraction. To be human is to exist within a network of real personal relationships where selves give themselves to others. And that brings me back to Luther and Melanchthon, for example. We might say that Luther's ideology and Luther's intuitions go in two different directions there. And his intuitions win. Because ultimately, Erasmus is far, far away. Melanchthon's a real human being. I remember reading some years ago a comment that George Orwell made. He was very critical of Sir Stephen Spender at some point in print. And I think he pointed to Spender's somewhat ambiguous sexuality at the time. And later, Spencer and Orwell met, and Spender commented that Orwell had never, ever gone after him in quite the same way again. Why was that? And Orwell said, well, if you remember, I met you at a party. And once I'd looked into your face, I knew you were a man like me. And I could no longer treat you just as a name or an idea. You were actually a person. Friendship teaches us that persons are not things. Friendships also enrich time. I've been very struck by, I became a granddad just over a year ago. And I still remember getting the news. And one of my colleagues in the corridor opposite me looked across my office and said, what are you sitting there with a big smile on your face for? And I said, I became a granddad 2 days ago. A granddad, not a grandma. I was not self-identifying as a woman at the time. I've always self-identified as a man. And I commented to him. I said, it brought to my mind Psalm 128, verse 6. Psalm 128, verse 6 is the great blessing. May you live to see your children's children. And I commented to my friend that I'd always assumed that what that meant was, may you live a long time. May you not only see your children, but may you see your children's children. When I saw my children's children, I realized that actually the psalmist is saying something deeper there. Not all time is the same. Some time is richer and more powerful than others. I think back over the years, time spent with friends is powerful time. You can spend an hour and a half, 2 hours with a friend. I can't remember any specific Latin lesson I ever took at school. I did Latin from the age of 10 or 11. I can still read Latin, so I must have been there. I just can't remember being there. Maybe Latin lessons are like the 60s. If you remember them, you weren't really there. But I still remember moments in time grabbed with friends. Particularly sort of the last time you see a friend and then they pass away. That the time is rich and deep. And it's more than just the chronology, the length of time. There is a quality to it. Time with friends is a blessing because friends too are a blessing. They are the ones who give us recognition. And they are therefore the ones who actually make our lives richer. That brings me then to the depressing section. What has the loss of friendship done to us? And I think we have lost the concept of friendship. I give a separate lecture on how we've lost the concept of friendship, but even the cheapening of the word. Friends are now people you link to on Facebook. I don't do Facebook. I barely do computers. I'm not very computer literate. But when you start using the language of friendship about people you've never met, you just happen to link to via some pixels online, the word is being diluted. What happens when we lose a rich concept of friendship? Well, first, and I was very gratified that Sister Thomas Moore commented on this after Ken's paper this morning. I think she was using, I can't remember the name of the book, but my own boys had to read it when they were at school. A Separate Peace, the book A Separate Peace. And she commented that the students she teaches find it very difficult not to read A Separate Peace as talking about same-sex attraction, because they don't have a category for powerful feelings that exist between people that are not sexual feelings. I think that the loss of a concept of rich friendship has left the field open to the radical sexualization of our society. It's not solely responsible for it, but I think the loss of friendship has really done damage to us on that front. I was talking to somebody who works for a group called Young Life. It's a Protestant ministry that works in public high schools. Sometime in the last 2 years, he popped into my office to say hi, and we were talking, and he mentioned to me that at the school where he teaches, at the school where he's working, I think in the among the 12 to 13-year-old girls, 80% of them identified as lesbian. And I asked him, why do you think that is? And his answer was, because they don't know what friendship is. They no longer have a category for friendship, which is not a sexual identity category. This morning, allusion was made to what is, I won't say it's the dominant interpretation of the friendship between David and Jonathan, but it's certainly one that is trotted out with disturbing regularity. That David and Jonathan's friendship has to be seen in terms of same-sex attraction. I don't think anyone would have read that passage that way even 100 years ago. The idea of deep male friendship was not alien. I'm a Protestant, so this is a guilty pleasure. One of my guilty pleasures, John Henry Newman. And John Henry Newman, I think one of the greatest, but neglected on this point, one of the greatest writers of the 19th century. I just think he writes beautifully. I mean, his style wouldn't work today. But in terms of 19th century, I would put him right up there with any of the great stylists one might care to think of. It's interesting reading John Henry Newman's letters, particularly the ones he exchanges with Ambrose St. John, his very dear friend. It's hard today not to read that language in a sexual way, because they write very passionately, which is kind of odd because they're 19th century Englishmen. I'm a 20th century Englishman, and we're not a whole lot more passionate than our 19th century forebears were. But they'd be very reserved in public, but their private correspondence is shot through with a passion that's read today, typically in a sexual way. But that's not what's going on at all. That's not what's going on at all. I think what you have there is a deep, loving friendship. I think it was Fran Mayer who asked the question, how's this sort of thing coming about? I do think that pornography plays into this in a big way. First of all, I think pornography reinforces one of those pressures that I said exists on the notion of friendship, that sees other people as means rather than ends. That's exactly what pornography teaches. It's not the only medium that teaches that, but that is one powerful message that comes from pornography. Other people exist as means rather than ends. It also, of course, reinforces that by identifying the sexual act with treating the other person as a means rather than an end. Instead of sex being about the giving of one person to another, sex becomes about the taking of something from another. I think pornography reinforces that way of imagining what it means to be a human being that tilts our notion of friendship away from true friendship and towards something more contractual and also something more sexual. I also think the loss of friendship creates terrible anxiety. What do I mean by this? Well, I was thinking about my experience of friendship at school compared to the experience of friendship that the students I teach at Grove typically have. For me, friendship only meant one thing. It meant the guys that I actually had a physical connection with on a regular basis. Friends were real presences. They didn't all go to my school. I didn't see all of my friends every day. But if I had a dozen friends, that was all I had. And most of them I saw on a regular basis. Now, if friendship is partly what I was talking about earlier on, it's that source of my sense of my own value because somebody else has freely recognized me as a person. Think about it. That's pretty easy to do when your friends are embodied presences. It's also pretty stable. I went to an all-boys school. I tell the students about what went on at my school today. They can't believe it. They can't believe we weren't either all in prison or the teachers weren't being sued or whatever. You know, the thing about male-to-male friendship among teenagers in all-boys school is every now and then it goes wrong and you fall out. And you have this great way of sorting it out. It's called fighting. You throw a few punches, the teacher comes along, smacks you around the back of the head. Half an hour later, you're all friends again. Nobody goes to counseling. Nobody's permanently damaged. But the thing is, you did fight. You got punched on those. I got a scar inside my lip where I was punched in the face. Even today, I can feel it. It's costly falling out when your friends are real presences, which actually gives a stability to friendship that I think is lacked today. When your friends are countless numbers of virtual people, it's very, very cheap for them to take pot shots at you. Very cheap indeed. Very, very cheap. And I don't care about Twitter, but every now and then somebody will point out a less than flattering comment that's made about me on Twitter, and I feel the pinch for like 30 seconds, and I don't care. What it must be like if that is where you get your recognition. That is fulfilling the function that those 12 guys I used to hang around with fulfilled for me. It has to be agony. It's why I don't like the younger generation being called snowflakes. I think they are, in many ways, a lot more sensitive than my generation. But I also think the lives they have to lead are a lot more complicated than my generation. Friendship reflects and is regulated and stabilized by bodily presence. I would also say the loss of friendship, of real friendship, fuels the myth of mastery. This has been touched on by a couple of other speakers as well. True friendship leaves me always understanding that who I am is in a deep sense a gift that comes from somebody else. That sense of dependency. When you lose the concept of friendship, I think you lose that intuition. You start to think that, yes, I can be whoever I want to be. You start to think that, yes, I am in control of my destiny. And I think that's a problem. And then finally, I think with the loss of friendship, and this is where I think it's particularly significant for Christians, I think the loss of friendship might culminate in the loss of the gospel. Very struck the Dutch Reformed theologian, Johannes Coxaeus. He was actually German, but he was professor at Utrecht, so he was really sort of Dutch theologian of the 17th century. At the heart of his understanding of covenant theology was the Amnesia Dei, the friendship of God. I haven't been to Utrecht for about 15 years, but there used to be quite a nice pub in the middle of Utrecht called the Amnesia Dei. And my friend Willem van Asselt, he's sadly died since, who was a great Coxaeus scholar, we would always go there and have a drink because he says it's the Coxaean pub. It's the pub where the Reformed meet to drink. The friendship of God. Think about how God's attitude towards his people touches on issues of friendship. He speaks to Moses in the tent of meeting, in what might call the very context of his covenant commitment to his people. He speaks to Moses as a man speaks to his friend. In the Aaronic blessing, what does he do? His face shines upon his people. He smiles. He indicates his friendship to his people in the great covenant benediction. And think of what that does. The friendship of God is surely integral to Christian identity. If I've made the case, try to make the case now that our identity, if you like, in the horizontal realm is enriched by and should in many ways be dependent upon our human friends, how much more is our ultimate identity grounded in the friendship of God? When God graciously gives himself to us as our friend, that gives us value. That gives us a sense of joy. And think about it. Human friendships are to some extent predicated on the intrinsic qualities of the parties involved. I'm typically not friends with people I don't like. I'm typically not friends with people I find to be thoroughly obnoxious. I didn't marry my wife because she was horrible. I married her because she's beautiful. And her beauty precedes my love for her. Human friendship, even with all that I've said about it being a gracious overflowing of oneself towards another, typically involves some intrinsic attractiveness in the person to whom one's grace overflows. That's not the case in the gospel. We might say God's friendship is the ultimate friendship. We don't even have a face that even a mother could love. God's friendship is the ultimate friendship. Forgive me for quoting Martin Luther here in Catholic Company. You can find more or less the same thing said by Thomas Aquinas in his commentary on Romans chapter 9, I think. But Luther says, the love of God does not find, but creates that which is lovely to it. That's in the Heidelberg Disputation, April 1518. That's the moment when Luther really starts to sort of articulate his what will become his Reformation theology in the public context. The point Luther is making there, and he'll contrast it, he will say, but human love responds to that which is lovely to it. The point Luther is making is that God's love is a creative love. It does not find that which is lovely, it makes that which is unlovely that which is loved. God's friendship, we might say, is like that. Our human friendships are but a bare shadow of the divine friendship. But if we have no concept of human friendship, how can we ever have a concept of divine friendship on that point? I think the loss of friendship also means we lose sight of the importance of the body. As I've said, as friendship today has become an increasingly disemboweled thing, partly because of the disembodied nature in which it appears to be conducted, true friendship emphasizes the importance of the body. And I think that ties us in to Christianity. It's not enough for Jesus to die, he has to be resurrected. The body is important. And I think the loss of friendship perhaps plays into a loss of something else that one could talk about. Haven't got time today. The loss of gratitude. I'm grateful to my friends. Spent last night with sitting, having a drink with Rusty and Fran. And it reminded me of how grateful I am for their friendship. They're under no obligation to me. And yet the overflow of their friendship is a delight for which I'm grateful. When I think of the things in life for which I am most grateful, it is not things. It is friends. It is people. To lose sight of friendship is perhaps to lose sight of gratitude as well. And that too, I think, is another unfortunate mark of our age. We live in an age of ingratitude and negation. So all of this is to say, friendship, I think, is critically important. I think the paradigm for friendship is God's friendship with Israel. And I think the loss of friendship in our society goes far to explain some of the things that are most egregious about the world in which we live. Not least, the anxiety and the ingratitude that so mark our age. Thank you very much for listening so patiently.
Thank you. Do you have questions?
Does that mean I cover the subject comprehensively, or I was incomprehensible? That's,
Thank you, Dr. Trueman. Really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed your example of the fighting the boys. Could we go back to revisit that for a second? Just so I could, at the boys' school. And actually, it really opened my eyes to the flip side of Sir Roger's observations about not loving a body part, but, you know, kissing your wife rather than your wife's face and so on, because it's the same thing with fighting in a sense. And actually, your example of the bruise on your lip, you know, it's one thing. If that had happened any other way, the way you would relate to that reality on your lip would be completely different. But I don't know if you remember the person who punched you, but...
oh, I do.
Okay.
I remember the name as well.
But this is my
Some
point.
things you never forget.
Yeah. Well, this is precisely my point. Because he hit you, you know, he didn't just hit your face, so to speak. But I guess what I want to understand about the example was the reconciliation part. Were you suggesting that it's part of the very fact that you're fighting in person and body, and so to speak, that leads to let's say, you're not just forgetting it. Were you suggesting that fighting in person leads to a more ready reconciliation, or not?
Not necessarily. I think what I was pointing to is a more general point that it takes time and energy to fall out with a friend who's a presence. It takes commitment and it takes effort. The tilt is towards reconciliation, on the whole, not always. I could draw an analogy. I've not been involved in many debates in my time, but what I've noticed about debates, and I'm not a particularly gifted debater, I hate them, generally. It's not my gift. But what I've noticed about the debates I've been involved in is when you're on the stage with the person you're debating, the temperature often goes down. It's very different on Twitter. When I watch discussion, I've never come across a debate on Twitter where the temperature hasn't just gone through the roof very, very quickly. What strikes me about engaging face-to-face with somebody with whom I disagree is typically the temperature's gone down somewhat. And why is that? And I think it's because bodies. It takes more courage, for want of a better word, to be really nasty to somebody's face. And also, there are other things that go on when you're on stage with somebody. There are bodily tics and tells that serve to defuse situations that you may not even be aware of yourself. Go back to the school then, I think, you know, if you're part of a group of 10 guys and 2 of you fall out, there are various pressures that come up, you know, reconcile. You're going to break up the group. You're going to have to sit in class, and it's going to be very, very awkward to sit in class with this person for the next 3 years. And all of that, I think, comes down to the fact that they're real presences in real space-time with real bodies. So I was not recommending fighting as the obvious thing to do in order to reconcile. It may have the opposite effect. But it was to say it indicates that falling out is costly. Falling out is costly when they're real people. If it's just some avatar on Twitter, it costs nothing to say the nastiest things about people.
Yeah, thank you. Because I'm thinking, too, that if you insult somebody on Twitter or somebody on who's a friend on Facebook, I was just thinking that you wouldn't feel the same need for reconciliation as would if you got into a fight face-to-face or whatever. I have to think this through more. But
Yeah, I think that's right. And I sometimes, this is sort of tangential, but I sometimes wonder, some people seem to think of the real world and the Twitter world as two discrete things. So I'll meet people who've said the most horrendous things about me online, but they'll be all smiles, and it's as if, how dare you be upset by what I said about you online? And it's kind of, well, I don't live in that sort of world where there are two realities. So I think there are all kinds of questions. If I could have three wishes, the first would be all social media disappear forever and never come back.
Hi, I'm Sandra Keating in the theology department here, and I do want to say that I have listened to your talk from last year 3 times. So it's all meaning that that I would have invited you back anyhow. So.
Oh, I thought you were saying it was totally incomprehensible, and you couldn't believe how bad it was the first time.
It was so good the first time. I listened to it again and again. So, first of all, I really appreciated a lot, so many things of what you said, but I really like the idea of this the model of friendship being Israel and God, in part because I think that points to something that you didn't go into too much, but there's a commitment there. The covenant, and Israel comes to recognize that a big part of that relationship with God is that God doesn't abandon them, no matter how bad they are.
Yeah.
And I think, when you were talking about anxiety, one of the things that I see in the younger generation is a lot of them come out of a world in which no one's really made a commitment to them, even their families. And I'll reveal a little bit. My son has dated numerous young women who showed up at our house who come from just disastrously dysfunctional families. And you see, there's a desire there for some kind of a stability and a place where they can feel like they can always come back, which of course generally makes them very needy. Okay, so there's like a cycle of anxiety and neediness and an inability to really form that kind of friendship because they don't know what that commitment is like. And I was just wondering if you could maybe expand a little bit on that or comment on that. If that's my impression. If you think that that's true.
I think you're absolutely correct on two fronts. During my time when I was a pastor, the difficult pastoral situations I had with young people all connected to dysfunctional family. And it's hard I can't generalize across the whole world, but my own experience exactly tracks with what you're describing there. That it was people who'd either been deeply betrayed by their parents when they were young, one had committed adultery or something like that, or just grown up in families where there was no real commitment to anybody. I do think this is a great opportunity for the church. I'm very struck that Paul, when he lists the qualifications for being an elder, lists hospitality. And again, the two brothers this morning, I was very interested in, I'm not sure they used quite this language, but essentially described a big part of their ministry as hospitality. They put on these great programs, but all the kids want to do is hang around, have a glass of wine or whatever, and chat. They wanted hospitality. I think the church has a great opportunity at this time to be an oasis of stability and commitment, and to show young people, getting married. I got married at 23. I've been married nearly 33 years. Greatest thing I ever did. I burned my bridges. I got rid of my options early, and I have no regrets about doing that. And again, you can argue that as an abstraction, and nobody will believe you. I think you have to actually show them it in practice. So I think there is a hunger for some kind of stability among young people, and the way to persuade them of the best way is to demonstrate what commitment looks like in our lives and our communities. I've said it in a different context a number of times, but if all the church does with the current increasing marginalization of the church in American life, if all the church does is lament that, it's a missed opportunity. I think it should be lamented. I don't rejoice that it's hard to walk down a street in the month of June without being, finding your kids confronted with what I would regard as gay pornography from shop windows. I think we should lament that, but I think we also need to think about, okay, it's the world we live in. How do we respond? Well, one of the ways we respond is by being a strong, loving community, and I think that will prove attractive. Thanks.
Doctor, you talk about the loss of gratitude, and we used to have a thing called thank you notes. And the other day in my class, a student had done something. I brought in some Dunkin' Donuts, whatever, and I said, "Well, we should send them a thank you note." And I got a blank stare from 20 people. and I said, "Well, you know," they said, "Well, no, you just do it on email. You just it shows up automatically. You could just put a thank you." And that takes care of it. I said, "Does anyone ever use thank you notes?" And they, "Oh, well, our grandparents did." So is that something that's lost today? I mean, is gratitude mechanical versus being human?
Again, I think mechanized gratitude is certainly an impoverished form of gratitude. Whenever I do thank you notes, I always handwrite them. I mean, I don't handwrite much beyond my journal. I do a journal and I handwrite thank you notes. But I do handwrite them because I want the person to know that, to say it's been costly to thank you is not. It's not costly, but it was worth a little bit of extra effort to give some thanks. I think the automation of thank you notes is not a great thing from that perspective. And I fear that gratitude is something that is dying in our world. But that's subject for another lecture. I could talk about that for another hour and a half.
Several times throughout today, the concept of vulnerability has come up. And the idea of embodied relationships, friendships, is kind of a high-stakes game, right? You know, it's not without its cost. And it seems to be that is actually one of the cons that causes people to move away from it, right? And we know that suffering is part of the fallen experience, and that God in his greatness takes what Satan means for evil and turns it into something good, the suffering of Christ being the ultimate example. And we know we wrestle not against flesh and blood. So I'm just curious, is your thought against, is there a satanic, element to this that would overthrow God's desire to use suffering and instead cause people to say, nah, the best part is no suffering at all. And in so doing, actually deny themselves the redemption that God offers through suffering?
Yeah, I'm inclined to say yes. Again, going back to what the two brothers said in the very first session today. They made a comment about, Satan's biggest plan is to isolate you. One might supplement that by saying, and Satan's biggest plan is to make you think that the valuable life is the one that's cost-free. Oddly enough, Nietzsche, I think, is sort of helpful at this point. I mean, reading Nietzsche on suffering is interesting because he understands that suffering, he refuses to go the Schopenhauer way and fights back against suffering and indicates that actually fighting back, facing suffering down as suffering can enrich life. Now, I wouldn't want to go quite down the Nietzsche route, but I would want to say, the way I try to illustrate with this for the students is there's always a student who's engaged in my class. I love to pick on the engaged. We're a Christian liberal arts college, so they all get engaged in the final semester. They all get married 48 hours after graduation. I had a funny scene the other week when I typically ask, when I'm trying to teach the distinction between treating people as means and ends, I ask one of the couple, if on your wedding day they swap the person out for somebody else, would you still marry them? The answer is always no. Until the other week, where the guy said his fiancée was absent. He said, probably not. And I said to him, you may want to reconsider the term probably in that sentence. But what I say to that, I say, you're in love with your fiancée. Are you ever apart? Yeah. Well, when you're apart, do you enjoy it? No. It's painful. And I said, and what does that tell you? And I said, it tells me that my love is true love and that my love is real. And the very thing that makes me get out of bed in the morning and makes my life worth living, my love for my fiancée, is actually real. And I said to him, yes, and you cannot have that love unless there's pain. You've got to run the risk of pain in order for that love to be real. And I might push it further and say, and you will not know how real your love is until you've experienced that pain. So I try to sort of cultivate the thinking about, let's think about love, and let's think about suffering relative to love. And suffering actually immeasurably enriches and enhances love. You know, if I outlive my wife predeceases me, it will absolutely break my heart. And that's a good thing, because if my wife died and I didn't give it a second thought, it would tell me that my marriage was worth nothing anyway. So I try to use illustrations like that as a way of getting young people to think, pain isn't just something to be avoided. Actually, pain can be something that teaches us about the richness of life as we actually live it. And again, it goes back to my point about you can teach about pain in the abstract all you want, and you'll never persuade them in the abstract that pain's a good thing. Get them to think about the 2 weeks they're away from their fiancé and the little bit of suffering that brings in its wake, and the lights go on and they begin to realize, yes, pain and commitment are actually what make life rich and worth living.
Carl, one of the interesting things that I've been watching during your presentation and Ken's earlier was that two of the speakers here at this conference are not Catholic, and yet both of you were received with an enormous amount of warmth. How did we get here to the point where this is possible?
Well, you brought me lunch in Philadelphia. That's how we got here. I think that I can't comment on what's going on in the Catholic Church, but my impression from talking to close Catholic friends, none of whom I will name here, is that many Catholics feel more affinity with Orthodox Protestants at this moment on a lot of issues than they do with high-ranking members of the Catholic Church. And I think within Protestant ranks, many of us realize that Protestant didn't begin on Christianity didn't begin on October the 31st, 1517. It has much deeper, richer roots. And many of us, I think, have come to appreciate the riches of the pre-Reformation tradition. Many of us have come to appreciate very deeply the centuries of Catholic social teaching that provide Christians with so many good resources for addressing the challenges we face today. And again, I think it goes to friendship. When I first became a Christian, Catholics were an abstraction. They were miserable because they were frightened, they had no assurance, they were legalists. These were all the things that I heard in my circles. And I had no reason to doubt that because I didn't know any Catholics. And it's been getting to know Catholics as friends and realizing that actually the characters I were taught were actually caricatures and not the truth that has really transformed my way of thinking. So I think a whole heap of things are going on at this point in time. I do think that what we have is more than just, hey, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I can stand shoulder to shoulder with a Muslim on certain issues, but I can never enjoy the Christian friendship with a Muslim that I would enjoy with yourself, say, Fran.
Really enjoyed your talk, Dr. Trueman, so thank you for being here. We had a brief moment to touch on this last year after your talk, but a recent article I was reading in Public Discourse noted a stat that seems to indicate that this topic is becoming a bit more prevalent. So something like 25% of Americans, according to Gallup, are now more than comfortable with multiple partners for married couples or romantically connected couples.
Yeah.
And I think there's something that's happening with friendship across gender, or maybe something that's not happening with friendship across gender that's actually leading to that or shifting the way that we relate to one another. Could you say a little bit more about friendship in a way that might actually be beneficial to stemming or curbing that trend within our culture?
Yeah, that's a very big question. And I think the answer is not simply teaching on friendship. I think teaching on what sex means. and how sex forges particular relationships is critical to answering that. I do think that I'm interested by the phrase friends with benefits that pops up, that really in my day just meant people who were sleeping together. The fact that friends is now connected to that lower levels of friendship involve sexual activity is striking to me. I don't know how to address that question beyond, well, let me put it, I think you can define nature for so long, and sooner or later nature bites back. I think that question will be resolved 30, 40, 50 years in the future when we see the social disaster that it's leading to. The tragedy of that is it's going to take a lot of ruined lives in order to bring us to that point. I make the comment to the students, isn't it interesting, Cosmopolitan never interview an 80-year-old swinger, because there are no 80-year-old swingers. They're old, they're broken, and they're alone, or they've ceased to be swingers. There's no middle ground there. So I think that we could sit and wait, and this, the pendulum was moving. We're already seeing it a little bit. Christine Ember's book, recent book, Louise Penny's book, Case Against the Sexual Revolution. We're beginning to see secular feminists starting to push back against this. Mary Harrington's new book, I'm not sure how. There are elements of Mary Harrington that make me think she might be religious, but keeping it a little bit quiet. I don't know. But certainly her arguments that she makes in her writings are not religious arguments. So I think there is evidence that there is a growing discomfort, particularly among women, that the kind of phenomena that you've described that flow from the sexual revolution are not good for women. And we may see some sort of general swing against that. But again, the best way I think that I could stand against it is by demonstrating in my own life a different way of living. The church walks the beat of a different drum. That's how the church, I think, was successful in the Roman Empire. It wasn't that the church came up with programs and techniques to solve the problem of the Roman Empire. The church became a strong community that was attractive to the wider community. Women were not being required to have abortions. Children were not being murdered if they were little girls. There were things that the Christian community did that ultimately proved very attractive to the natural instincts of people around. So maybe that's the answer. I see it getting a lot worse before it gets better, whatever. I think we're only just beginning to see the start of this.
That's great advertising for a disputation that we'll have next week with a couple of those authors who will be here on campus.
Oh, wonderful.
Discuss
Which
their work.
authors?
Rick, which authors? Louise Perry.
Excellent.
She's one of them. So come back next week. Dr. Trueman has to catch a vehicle soon. So one last question. We have time for one last. So who's going to ask the last question? This is your chance.
Well, my second wish would be a modification of the first, that let me have access to a form of social media that allows me to get pictures of my granddaughter. And the third wish, well, I think my big ambition, and I have the haircut for it now, my big ambition would be to be a James Bond villain. So I think I need the big yacht moored somewhere in the Mediterranean where I can plot world takeover. That would be my third wish. So.
On that note, please thank you.
Thank you.